I never imagined it would be inside a prison where love and hate would mix in the most intense way possible. A story that wasn't supposed to happen, but that took me by surprise, transformed my life, and made me realize that sometimes the rules are made to be broken. Not that I wanted it, but fate led me to this. I, Lucas, 27 years old, never thought my heart could be taken by someone like him. The detective, a man of 35, with the stature of someone in authority, with piercing eyes that left me vulnerable in his presence. I didn't know what he saw in me. And even more, I didn't know that a simple glance from him would be enough to stir what I tried so hard to keep hidden inside of me. Although I was behind bars, every time he walked into that visitation room, time seemed to stop. I was no longer just a prisoner. I wasn't even there. I was with him. When his eyes met mine, there were no bars, no limits. There was only that moment, that furtive touch, that stolen kiss. He shouldn't have been there. He was the detective, the law, the man who controlled what I did and didn't do. But he was there, and what I felt for him, I knew couldn't be shared with anyone. Especially not with him, who couldn't show anything either. At least not in public, and there was the other one. The guard. He had always been there, and when he was at the door, everything became more difficult. His gaze, full of envy and possessiveness, made me feel like I was doing something wrong when, in reality, the only mistake was him. He wanted the detective. He wanted his attention, his touch, everything the detective had to give me. But the detective wasn't interested in him. He was interested in me. And this story, this secret, was only just beginning. I remember it like it was yesterday, the first time he walked into that visitation room. It wasn't a normal visit, it wasn't something routine. He came there with a purpose, but when his eyes met mine, it was as if fate had chosen us. He walked in, firm as always, with the posture of someone who had control. But inside, I knew something was happening. The heat in his gaze, the way he approached, the way our bodies almost touched, it was like he was telling me without words, "You are mine." I, a common prisoner with a disordered soul, looked at that man and felt there was nothing else in the world that mattered. Only him. He had the power to make me forget where I was. I didn't feel confined anymore. I felt free in his gaze, free in the touch of his hand, which, even though subtle, burned my skin. "Are you okay, Lucas?" His voice was calm, but there was something provocative in it, as if he knew every word coming out of his mouth affected me. I could barely respond. All I wanted was to be near him. Feel the warmth of his body, and it was right then, at that moment, that I realized I couldn't escape this. Whatever it was between us, it was becoming inevitable. But there was someone who wasn't happy about our story, the guard. I saw him all the time, watching, standing at the door of the visitation room, trying to disguise his jealous, angry stare. He knew what was happening between me and the detective, and it consumed him. His gaze was full of hate, but also desire. He wanted the detective, but the detective didn't look at him the same way. The guard was 38 years old, and despite being a large, strong man, he seemed fragile when it came to the detective. He was there, always watching, waiting for an opportunity to separate us. When the detective touched me, he seemed to tense up even more. I could feel the heat of his anger, but I also knew that, unlike me, he would never have the chance to be touched by the detective the way I was. I could see that in his eyes. It was as if his ego was hurt, as if he couldn't accept that the detective had something with a prisoner, someone who was there, behind bars, someone who shouldn't have the right to be loved, to be desired. And even though he tried, even though he used force to try to interrupt our moments, there was something between the detective and me that was stronger. The detective wanted me. And every time he came back, every time he entered that visitation room, he showed me, without words, that what we were living couldn't be denied. It couldn't be erased. It was real, and it was dangerous. Over time, our meetings became more frequent. He came in the afternoons, when the guard seemed more distant or when he distracted himself with something. The detective always watched me with a tense calmness, as if he knew what it meant but still couldn't reveal it. He was between want and need, between duty and desire. I knew he couldn't touch me publicly, but in that confined space, he touched me in ways I could no longer ignore. Gently on my arm, in a gesture that seemed insignificant, but that burned my body from the inside. I gave myself to every touch, every closeness. He seemed to feel it when he spoke. His voice was softer, more intimate, and I just wanted time to stop, so he could stay there, with me, forever. "You have no idea what you do to me, Lucas." He whispered those words as if it were a secret, as if it were a sin. But it was right there, at that moment, that he was more real than ever. More himself than ever. The tension grew with each visit. Every meeting between us became more charged with emotion, with repressed need, with something that could not be openly expressed. The prison guard knew this. He could feel the space between us being filled with an invisible force, something he could not control. He tried to separate us, tried to shout, but never had the courage to act. He knew the officer would not give in to him. The truth was that in that confined space, in that world of confinement, I had found something I never thought I would. A love that was beyond any limit. The officer, with all his power and authority, was now my refuge. He was my strength. When he was there, everything became easier. The prison, the walls, the weight of confinement, all of it disappeared. There was only us, and even though I knew it couldn't last, even though I knew it was a risky game, I couldn't resist. When the officer was there was nothing else. There was no guard, no system, no one else. Only him, only me, and the desire for us to be together. But things were about to change. The tension was reaching its peak. The guard, with his angry glares, was no longer willing to watch passively. He wanted the officer's attention. He wanted to control the situation, and I knew he would do something to separate us. But what he didn't know was that the officer had already made his decision. He wanted to be with me, and nothing, not even the guard, could stop us. The next visit from the officer, I knew, would be different. Something was going to happen, something that would change everything. The officer's visit that afternoon felt like a promise. I knew he was coming, and the mere fact that I knew he was on his way made my heart beat faster, but something was in the air. The guard was no longer just an uncomfortable presence. He was becoming a real threat. That afternoon, he seemed more determined than ever to interfere in what we were living. I remember looking at the clock as I waited, feeling a knot in my throat. The guard was at the door, standing still, watching everything with an intensity that made me uncomfortable more and more. He seemed to approach me with a possessive look. What did he want? I knew he was dying of envy for the officer, but what he didn't understand was that the officer wasn't his. He would never be his. When the officer entered, the atmosphere seemed to change. He didn't need to say anything. Just his gaze said it all. He was here for me. There were no more doubts. There was no more space for anything except for the two of us. The room was silent, the sound of our heavy breathing filling the air. I could feel his warmth, the desire pulsing between us. "Lucas," he murmured, his voice rough and laden with tension. His gaze stayed fixed on mine, as if there was nothing else around us. He approached, his steps slow and heavy, yet at the same time full of urgency. He extended his hand and, with a careful gesture, touched my face. His touch was always like this, soft, yet possessive. He wanted me. I felt it in every fiber of my being. The guard was there at the door, but the officer seemed to ignore him completely. The guard, arms crossed, was more rigid than ever. I could feel the tension radiating from him. He wanted something. He wanted to pull me away from the officer, to take his place, but that wasn't going to happen. The officer was determined to have me, and nothing could change that. I knew the guard was about to do something, but I didn't know what. He was furious, and I could see it in every movement of his. When the officer touched me, his body coming closer to mine, the tension in the room became palpable. The guard couldn't take it anymore. He took a step forward, interrupting the moment between us. "You can't do this," he said, his voice trembling with rage. "Not here." "Not like this." I looked at the officer, hoping he would do something, but he remained calm. There was a coldness in his gaze that made me feel he had total control of the situation. He was no longer just the officer, he was my man, and no one could interfere. "I'm not breaking any rules," the officer replied, his voice deep and assured. "I'm not a guard here anymore. I'm here as a man, and you won't stop me." The guard, furious, tried to move to separate us, but the officer quickly stood up with firmness, placing his hand on the guard's chest to stop him from getting any closer. "Don't dare touch me," he said, with an authority that made the guard step back. "You know very well who's in charge here." The tension was almost unbearable. The guard, feeling challenged, looked at me with anger. I could see his desire to control the situation, to control the officer, but the officer wouldn't yield. He had already made his choice, and that choice was clear. He wanted to be with me. The guard left the room, visibly frustrated, and I was left there alone with the officer. He approached me again, his gaze full of need. "I can't stay away from you anymore," he said, his voice low and husky. "I need you, only you." I pulled him to me, feeling the urgency in his touch. The desire between us was growing, and every moment without him felt like an eternity. When he kissed me, it was as if the whole world fell silent around us. I felt the strength of his arms enveloping me, the warmth of his body, and I knew it was real. Nothing could separate us now. With every touch, every caress, time seemed to disappear. It didn't matter that we were in prison. It didn't matter that it was forbidden. Nothing mattered. What mattered was that we were together, and that was enough. More and more, I gave myself to him without reservation, without fear. The guard, although he had left the room, knew that something was changing. He wouldn't give up so easily, and as I knew this would happen, I began to prepare myself. Something was about to explode, but for now, I had the officer by my side, and that was what mattered most. The air in the visitation room was heavy, and time seemed to slow, as if the hours didn't want to pass. The officer pulled away slightly, but his eyes were fixed on me, as if every second we spent together was too precious to waste. I could see the anxiety in his eyes. He wanted more. I wanted more. But the reality of the prison always reminded us that at any moment, it could all end. When the door closed behind the guard, the room became ours again. No words were needed. The desire between us spoke louder than anything else. I knew that at any moment, he could come back. The guard was an obstacle I couldn't ignore, but in that moment, there was only the officer and me. Suddenly, a noise in the distance made me freeze. It was the sound of heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway, and I knew something was wrong. I looked at the officer, who furrowed his brow, alerted by the same sense of imminent danger. He quickly stood up, heading toward the door of the visitation room, placing his hand on the doorknob with the same calm he always showed, but with an air of tension that was becoming all too familiar. I was in shock. My body was still tense from the guard's aggression, but when I saw the delegate protecting me, something inside me broke. He was willing to do anything for me. He was ready to confront the system itself, to face anyone who tried to separate us. And that made me feel something stronger than I ever thought possible, a deep, fierce love that defied all the rules. The delegate approached me, his eyes now softer, yet still holding the strength of a determined man. He cupped my face in his hands and, with a hoarse voice, said, "Are you okay? I won't let anyone hurt you." I couldn't respond immediately. I only felt the intensity of his words and the weight of the moment. All I wanted was to stay there, with him, the prison, the walls, the chains. None of that mattered. It was just him. It was just me. He pulled me closer and without another word, kissed me. The kiss was urgent, as if he was trying to convince me that nothing else mattered, that there was nothing that could separate us. Every touch, every kiss made me forget everything happening around us. But the truth was, the war wasn't over. The guard was still out there, and I knew he wouldn't give up so easily. But for now, in that moment, I had the delegate by my side, and that was enough. After the guard left, the door slammed shut with a loud bang that echoed through the room. I stood there, silent, smelling the mix of sweat and fear, blended with the scent of the delegate's perfume. My body was still trembling from the guard's touch, and I knew that nothing would ever be the same after that scene. But something was different now, something stronger between the delegate and me. The delegate pulled away slightly, breathing deeply, trying to regain control of the situation. His eyes were intense, as if he was still processing what had just happened. He looked at me but didn't speak immediately. I, on the other hand, felt an urgent need to get closer to him. I wanted to touch him, to feel his presence, but the tension still lingered in the air. The guard had left a mark on both of us. You okay? He asked, finally. His voice was soft, but I could sense the worrying in his eyes. It was hard to believe that a man as strong and imposing as him could show vulnerability before me, but there, in that moment, he did. His hand reached out to my face, touching it gently, carefully, as if he feared I might break at any moment. I nodded, trying to keep my composure. The pain from the guard's shove was still in my body, but the delegate's kiss, hot and urgent, had given me some relief. It didn't matter what happened from that point on, I knew he was there to protect me. He was my refuge, my only light in that dark, suffocating prison. I never imagined this would happen. I whispered, my voice barely audible. I never thought you would protect me like this, you. You risked everything for me. The delegate took a deep breath and moved closer, his presence overwhelming the room. He looked at me with intensity, and there was something in his eyes, something I still couldn't fully identify, but it made me feel even more vulnerable before him. I won't let anyone hurt you, Lucas, he said, almost possessively. You have no idea what this means to me. I know what I'm risking. I know the consequences could be severe, but double quotes. He paused, looking down for a moment, as if trying to gather his thoughts, but it doesn't matter. You're worth it, Lucas. He pulled me closer, and this time, I didn't resist. Our bodies met with urgency that almost made me lose control. When he kissed me, it wasn't a soft kiss. It was wild, full of suppressed desire, of accumulated tension that now seemed to explode. The heat of his body against mine made me forget everything. But then, in the back of my mind, something made me hesitate. Something I didn't want to face, but knew was there. The guard. I knew he wouldn't give up so easily. He was furious, and his obsession with the delegate wasn't going to diminish with a simple defeat. He was a proud man, and that pride, mixed with jealousy, made him unpredictable. As I surrendered to the delegate's embrace, the fear of the guard's return haunted me. I knew that no matter how hard we tried, this love story would never be easy. There was much more at stake than just our hearts. There was an entire prison, full of rules and forces that wanted to tear us apart. I can't let the guard interfere anymore, the delegate said, his voice now firmer, more determined. He was thinking about something, and the way he looked at me revealed that he was making a decision that could change everything. I knew he was putting his own life at risk for me, but at the same time, I didn't want him to do it. I didn't want him to lose himself because of me. Lucas, if I have to face the guard, I will do it. He can't separate us. Not anymore. Before I could respond, the door to the visiting room opened abruptly, and the guard entered again, this time without warning. His gaze was distorted, full of anger and frustration. He couldn't stand the idea of seeing us so close, so united. You think you'll stay with him, delegate? The guard growled, his voice almost inaudible with rage. You think you'll replace me like this? I'm not just a guard. I'm more than that. I can be more. I should be more. The delegate immediately stood up, positioning himself between me and the guard like an impenetrable wall. His posture was rigid, his jaw tense, and I knew there would be no more talking. The guard was about to explode, and the delegate was ready to face whatever came our way. "You won't threaten me anymore, Carlos," the delegate said with a coldness that made me feel a wave of respect and admiration for him. "Enough, this ends now." The guard lunged forward, but the delegate was quicker. With a precise movement, he grabbed the guard's arm and shoved him against the wall, causing him to lose his balance. The impact was so strong that the sound echoed in the room, and the guard stood there, frozen for a moment. "You want to fight me? You want to challenge my authority?" The delegate asked, his voice calm in a way that was almost frightening, as if he were weighing every word. "You're no longer in control. You never were." Carlos looked at the delegate, still trying to catch his breath. I could see the internal struggle in him. He wanted much more than just to separate me from the delegate. He wanted to destroy what was happening between us, but I knew that no matter what he tried, it wouldn't matter. The delegate was ready to fight, and so was I. The guard backed away, humiliated, but still with a look of hatred. He knew the battle was lost, and for now, that was enough. The delegate looked at me again, with dark eyes, but also with the promise that he wouldn't leave me. "We're leaving here," the delegate said, still with the firmness that gave me a sense of security. I nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and desire. All I wanted was to be with him. No more interruptions, no more barriers. I wanted to be in his arms, far from everything that kept me trapped. After the confrontation with the guard, things seemed to settle for a moment. But I knew the danger was still there, lurking, ready to resurface at any time. The delegate guided me down the prison corridor, his hand firmly on my waist, an anchor that kept me grounded while anxiety consumed me. The last exchange of glances with the guard was still etched in my mind. He wouldn't give up easily, but the delegate was more determined than ever. Our walk to the visiting room was short, but intense. I felt each step as if it were a heavier burden on my soul, each second farther from what gave me a sense of belonging. When we arrived, he gently turned me around and closed the door behind us, as if the outside world no longer existed. The silence was oppressive, but there was something comforting in his presence. He was there for me, and that gave me strength. "I won't let Carlos hurt us anymore, Lucas." The delegate's voice was calm, but there was a visible tension in his eyes, as if he was still processing everything that had happened. "Not anymore. I need you, and you need me. We're in this together now." I wanted to believe his words. I wanted it more than anything, but there was a growing doubt in my heart. What would happen if he couldn't protect me all the time? What would happen when the guard returned? He was dangerous, not just physically, but emotionally. I could see the desire, the rage, the jealousy, all mixed together, dominating him. He couldn't forget me, and if he wanted revenge? Before I could respond, the delegate approached, touching my face with his palms, as if trying to dispel any dark thoughts that. The officer looked at me, and for a moment, everything seemed to calm down. He took a step back, distancing himself from the jailer, and then glared at him with a defiant look. "Leave now, Carlos, and if you try again, you'll regret it." The jailer stood still for a moment, speechless, breathing heavily. Then, finally, with one last exchange of glances, he turned and left, slamming the door behind him. The silence in the room after the jailer's departure was overwhelming. I could hear the sound of my own breath, heavy, trying to process everything that had just happened. The officer, who seemed so sure, so unbeatable, was standing there in front of me, with a tired look in his eyes. His gaze was fixed on me, but something in it had changed. There was uncertainty, a void, as if he had made a decision he couldn't undo. I knew what he was thinking. He was letting the jailer get involved. He was giving in. "Lucas ... double quotes." He said my name with a softness that, in any other situation, would have calmed me. But now it just left me even more frustrated. He took a step towards me, but I didn't move. Frustration and disgust spread through me like a rising tide, swallowing me whole. Just needed to be sure. You understand, don't you? Of course, I understood he needed to be sure, but that certainty came at a heavy cost. It cost more than I could bear. I wasn't a toy for him. I wasn't something he could use, test, and then discard when things got complicated. And yet, he had done exactly that. You're going to stay with him, aren't you? I tried to hide the tremor in my voice, but I couldn't. The sound came out weaker than I would have liked. He looked at me, and for a moment, it seemed like he wanted to say something, but couldn't. He seemed torn, lost. He no longer knew where I fit into his life. That moment of tension lasted seconds, but it felt like an eternity. I wanted to scream, to protest. I wanted to knock everything that seemed to be crumbling on top of me. But instead, I just turned away. Wordlessly, it wasn't running away, not anymore. It was simply what was left for me. Silence, abandonment. The officer, still unsure of what to do, began to leave the room, hesitating before touching the doorknob. I didn't know if he was going after the jailer or if he was just trying to make sense of everything. But seeing him leave, leaving me alone again, was enough to break me, and that's when I saw the jailer again. He was there in the hallway, watching me with a possessive look. He knew I was weak. He knew the officer would leave to try to preserve his own sanity. The jailer wanted to see me fall, wanted to see me crumble, but at the same time, he hated me. His desire for me wasn't pure. He wanted more than just physical pleasure. He wanted to see me destroyed. He wanted to use me, control me, break me, but I didn't give in, not immediately. I knew what I had with the officer was more than just a night of passion. But now, alone in the cell, with the narrow walls closing in on me, with the other prisoners starting to look at me differently, I began to wonder if the officer really knew what he was doing, if he truly wanted me, or if I was just a distraction, a temporary escape. Something he got involved in, but now, for some reason, he didn't know how to handle. The night dragged on. And even with the jailer watching me from afar, with other inmates trying to engage me in conversations, my body and mind were stuck on one thought: the officer. I wanted him back. I wanted him to break that decision, that doubt that had settled between us. But instead, I was here, abandoned once more, alone with my feelings, with the emptiness of the prison and the desire still burning in my veins. And then, without warning, he returned, the officer. He appeared at the door of my cell, panting, as if he had run for miles. His look was nervous, but at the same time determined, and that made me take a step forward, toward him. I knew he was there for me, and only for me. There was no jailer anymore, no more confusion that separated us. He had come back, and that, for a moment, made my heart beat faster. Lucas, I couldn't stay away. The officer was breathing heavily, but his gaze. That gaze was the same as before, the look of someone who cared, who wanted something more. He was there, in front of me, with heavy breathing and restless eyes, as if he were saying everything without words. As if he wanted to apologize, but at the same time, didn't know how. But what about Carlos? I asked, my voice firm, despite the growing fear. I didn't know what was happening, but something inside me, a flame of anger and desire mixed, stopped me from backing down. Are you staying with him? The officer quickly shook his head, with a faint smile on his face. He took a step closer to me, and his cold, firm hand touched my arm. I can't anymore. He seemed sincere, but doubt still lingered in my thoughts. But I didn't want to question him anymore. I wanted to believe him. I needed to. Before I could say anything, he pulled me close, his lips meeting mine in a desperate kiss. It was as if he were trying to make up for everything he had done, and at the same time, showing me that what we both felt wasn't just a game. He was here for me, and nothing else mattered. But the question still echoed in my mind. How long would this last? How much longer could I endure this whirlwind of emotions? And the jailer, he wasn't going to give up. I knew that. But now, I just wanted to know one thing. How far would the officer go to protect what we had? The officer turned to me, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and desire. I knew he wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. Instead, he took a step towards me and hugged me tightly as if he was trying to protect me. As if he knew that, from that moment on, things would never be the same. He had made a choice. And now, we were both trapped in it, no matter how much we tried to escape. The room seemed quieter than ever. I wanted to believe that what was happening between us was real, that it wasn't just another fleeting moment. But with the presence of the jailer and the possibility of everything falling apart, I knew nothing would be easy. The consequences would come one way or another, and I just wanted one more chance to live this with him, without the fear of being interrupted, of being left behind. But in that moment, the officer slowly pulled away, his eyes never leaving mine. "I need to sort this out," he said, his voice deep, as if he were preparing for a battle he didn't know if he would win. And with that, he left, leaving me alone once again, in the same prison that had once seemed to be my only place in the world. I stood there motionless, feeling the pain of separation, but also a growing sense of expectation. What would he do? What would be the next step? I didn't know, but I knew I couldn't turn back anymore. And so, the cycle continued, the tension, the desire, the fear, all intertwining as I anxiously waited for what would come next. If you like this chapter and want to see part 2, write Officer, Jailer, and the Prisoner Part 2 in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. The story isn't over. What will happen to the officer and the jailer? What awaits us in the next chapter? Stay tuned, the plot is just beginning.